Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hello and welcome back to the Podcast Cafe. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, and today my guest is podcaster Fiorella, also known as Fio. She is the host of the Not Your Spicy Latina podcast. A little bit about Fio before we get into this. She is an immigrant, first-generation Latina, and certified professional coach. As the founder of Latinas Ahead, she is dedicated to providing culturally sensitive career coaching that empowers Latinas to build self-worth and confidence. She guides them to embrace their inner strength, show up authentically, and discover their superpowers so they can thrive in their careers as the talented, multifaceted, and fearless individuals that they are. Through her podcast, Not Your Spicy Latina, she amplifies the voices of Latinas by creating a safe space to share their stories, break down stereotypes, and honor the rich diversities and depths of Latina experiences. So in this episode, you're going to be learning more about Fio and why she created this podcast. We also talk about representation and community building and why that's crucial for breaking stereotypes. And then also how she creates a safe space within her podcast to share these stories. Fio also shares her best tips for letting your personality shine through your podcast. So let's get right into this episode. And if you have any questions for Fio or myself, all of our links are in the show notes. Hey Fio, thank you so much for being on the Podcast Cafe. I am so excited to be chatting with you today.
Thank you, Haley. I am so happy to be part of the podcast.
Yes.
Super excited.
Oh my gosh. Well, before we get into everything about Not Your Spicy Latina podcast, I have to ask you, since we're in the Podcast Cafe, what is your go-to coffee order?
Great question. So I would say I try to keep it very simple. So I like a chai latte with almond milk or soy milk. But now that it's fall season, I actually get super excited because you get all this like crazy pumpkin spice flavors and all these things. So I love a good pumpkin spice flavor latte.
Oh, me too. I went to a coffee shop last week and I saw peppermint was on the menu now. And I was like, oh, I can't wait.
Yeah. It's like the holidays bring the joy in coffee flavors.
They really do. I'm excited to get into all about your podcast. And I'd love for you to kind of start this off by describing your podcast in 3 words.
Ooh. I would say my podcast, when I think 3 words, I think empowerment, I think inspirational, and I think fun.
I love those. I think empowerment is a great first word for that because your podcast is so empowering. And let's get right into it. So can you tell us more about what your podcast is and why you started it?
Yes, of course. So Not Your Spicy Latina is a podcast that is really aiming to break down stereotypes that as Latinas we face, day to day. That's where the name came from. So for anyone who's listening who's a Latina, I don't know how many times we introduce ourselves as Latinas and then the response is, oh, you must be so spicy or like so sexy, right? But there are so many other words that can describe us. We're talented, we're smart, we're resilient, we're strong. And so the podcast is really about amplifying the voices of Latinas, sharing their stories of strength and resilience, and showing people what else is like when they think of Latinas, what else they should be thinking about, because we're multifaceted and the podcast is really about showing the stories and the lives of multifaceted Latinas.
Absolutely. I think breaking down that stereotype through your podcast It's exactly what your mission is. That's exactly what you're doing. And I love the name you picked for it because totally, I
Thank
mean,
you.
it's such a stereotype of like, oh, sexy, spicy Latina, and
Yeah.
it's such a stereotype. And so I like how you have that play on words with it, kind of calling people out of like, no, I'm not your
Yeah.
spicy Latina. I'm like so much more. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate the title of that. How did you come up with the name? Was it just like one day you were like, you know what? No, I'm not your spicy Latina.
Oh no. It was like months. Like
Mm,
it's like I don't have children, okay? But I can only like think equate it to like picking your baby's name. Like when you have any sort of like business or endeavor or anything that you've created, putting a name to it makes it real. Like I'm
yeah.
sure you, Haley, have experienced that with your podcast too. Like it's yeah, you're like solidifying what it means. And I tried not your average Latina, not your regular Latina, but I wanted there to be that like punchy line of like, no, we're not just sexy, like we're more than that. And then spicy just came to mind. I was like, not your spicy Latina.
Hmm.
That like I just got so excited. I was like, this is perfect. This is
Yeah.
exactly what the podcast will be about.
No, I love that. I really love that. So, was there a situation that made you start this podcast? Now, I know if you want to get a little bit into how you help people in your business, that obviously plays a role in starting the
Mm.
podcast. But was there a moment when you decided that a podcast like this needed to be out in the world?
Yeah, great question. So yes, so two answers to that. So definitely, yes, I'm glad you brought it up. My business is Latinas Ahead, so I do career coaching for Latinas, and so I knew that I wanted to create a business that had like a social impact, like an impact on Latinas' lives because of experiences that I have faced as a Latina and an immigrant. But the podcast idea, it's aligned to it because a lot of the topics, and I know we'll get into that, a lot of the topics are around professional development and career and empowering women and inspiring them. The podcast itself, the idea was because I wanted a creative outlet for a long time. I work in human resources, which to me is super fun. And I know for a lot of people it'd be like, oh, that's so boring, which is not. But it's like sometimes, I don't know if you've ever felt this way, you need a little outlet outside of like your traditional 9 to 5.
Hmm.
Because I've been in HR for so long, I've built a lot of one-on-one relationships through coaching. So I really like getting to know people on a personal level, one-to-one, creating this intimate connections, creating trust. And so I felt like a podcast would be a great way for me to get this creative itch that I had while also connecting with people. And then when I thought about, okay, what is the goal of the podcast? Like, what is the mission behind it? Who am I going to be interviewing? Latinas just made like the most sense because as I was listening to other podcasts to inspire me to take that leap into creating my own, I was finding that there weren't a lot of Latinas having podcasts about the things that I talk about.
Hmm.
And so there aren't a lot of Latina coaches or a lot of career coaches that target specifically Latinas in their services. So I felt that there was a gap there for us. I haven't found a podcast that touches on topics that I'm touching in my podcast. So I figured it would be a great platform for Latinas to just be highlighted and featured because we need more of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you're really creating this community with your business and then amplifying that with your podcast. So,
Yeah.
who is it that you interview on your show?
Yep. So I interview any Latina who is doing something that's really cool or really amazing, something that they're proud of, particularly as it relates to their career. So, because again, it's tying into my career coaching, we talk a lot about career development, professional development. Most of my guests right now have been entrepreneurs. So, I was reading this article the other day that talked about how Latinos are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs right
Mm.
now. There's like 1.5 million. And I thought that was really cool. I'm like, oh, there's something here. And I think my podcast is showing that in the people that I'm interviewing because a lot of Latinas, when we talk about career development, we've talked about some of the disadvantages that we have faced in corporate America. So a lot of Latinas are now saying, you know what, I'm just going to create my own business. I don't have to work for someone else. So a lot of my guests are entrepreneurs who have built their own businesses. But what is really beautiful, I think, about our episodes is that while a lot of the focus has been on how they've grown their careers and then transitioned to becoming entrepreneurs, there's a whole other layer in their story of like what it's like to be an immigrant here or a children of immigrants, what it's been like to experience burnout and mental health issues as a Latina, because we didn't grow up knowing or talking about therapy. Like
Hmm.
it was like, just get it together.
Yeah.
Like our parents didn't go to therapy. And
Right.
so we talk about limiting beliefs around and mindset around finances because our parents grew up with not a lot of money. And so in those episodes, while we are covering the entrepreneurial journeys and the professional development, we're really touching on the unique experiences of Latinas to get to where they are today.
Absolutely. And beyond just doing these interviews, I think that you're really helping more people embrace their identity, like that stat that you just shared of,
Mm,
Latinas being the fastest growing entrepreneurs in like that's I had no idea. That's amazing. And I think that,
yeah.
podcasts like yours do make that possible because, you know, breaking out of the
Thank you.
norm is never an easy thing to do within
Mm,
anything. If you're in a 9 to 5 and you want to start your own business, that's scary. Or if you're from a family that has no entrepreneurs and
yep.
your parents, want you to do one sort of thing, breaking out of that norm is terrifying. So I think that you're,
Yes.
yeah, I think that you're really giving people a place where they can come and hear what is possible.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Absolutely, we've had. I love Haley that you touched on that because we've had so many conversations around. This is not the environment that we grew up in, right? And
Hmm.
we were, at least for like my culture, especially if you immigrated here, your parents want you to be a doctor or a lawyer or yeah, one of those two, doctor, lawyer, scientist, uh, something that is going to have like the traditional jobs that they felt were something to be really proud of, right? So I've interviewed people who were maybe scientists or chemists and now they're bloggers, right? and
Hmm.
and for parents that's like, wait, what are you doing? So and also when I'm talking to my guests, a lot of them, like, I'm really inspired by the common themes of a lot of my guests have been the first people in their families to even earn a college degree,
Wow.
much less have their own businesses. So there's this common, I think, camaraderie in us, like a common understanding of we have very similar stories in that sense. And a lot of us are also battling with this need to make our parents proud, but then also following our own path, which now is entrepreneurship. So there's a lot there to unpack that I'm having a lot of fun doing because I'm learning about myself, I'm learning about my community, and it's just been like so special.
Totally. So, when someone listens to the podcast, how do you bring that sense of community maybe into another place like Instagram or wherever it is that you hang out? Like, how do you invite more people to come connect with you and join the community that you're creating on a deeper level?
Yeah, good question. So I am active on Instagram and LinkedIn right now are kind of my main platforms. I'm also on TikTok, but that's like a whole other monster that I'm
Yeah.
trying. As a millennial, I'm like Gen Zers, like you have to teach me the ways of
Yeah.
TikTok because I haven't gotten it yet. But Instagram and LinkedIn tend to be my two top platforms where I am posting teasers, sneak peeks, episode clips, and I've only had the podcast for a couple of months now out. I'm releasing episode 10 tomorrow, which I'm excited about.
Congrats.
And so, thank you. So far, it's been great to see that I'm getting like a lot of engagement for a similar, like the same group of people who are responding on LinkedIn when I post a new clip or Instagram. And I'm even hearing that people are connecting with each other. So they'll
Hmm.
listen to a guest episode and then they'll connect. I had one person reach out to me and tell me, Theo, I got a client who was one of your guests, and we both like really liked each other's episodes, and we just DM'd each other because nowadays you just DM people,
Yeah.
and they got to connect, and now they're working
That's
together.
awesome.
And I also have, through my guests, I've started working with them because they offer services that I need as an entrepreneur, like social media management. And
Hmm.
so I've hired them as my clients. And so little by little, we're continuing to create this community. We're connecting with each other. I'm trying my best to connect people whenever I can. Something that I'm looking to launch next year is a newsletter, which I think will be a great place to like really solidify or start solidifying the community that I'm creating through the podcast.
Very cool. Yeah, definitely. And, we connected on Entreprenista, which is a networking
Yeah.
group. Do you find that communities like that help grow your podcast and brand?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Like Entreprenista has been a blessing. It's been the best thing that's happened for me as a new entrepreneur because, and I think you and I talked about it at some point, it can be a very lonely road
Hmm.
when, especially if you're, like we were talking, if you're the only person in your family who's an entrepreneur or in your circle of friends, and you need guidance, you need resources, and sometimes you just need to vent with someone. Let's be honest,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes you just need someone that you can be like, oh my gosh, this week was harsh. So Entreprenista and like other communities for entrepreneurs and business owners, I recently joined one. It's called Latinas in Podcasting. So it's other Latina podcasters, and it's been great to listen to their podcast and connect with them. I got featured last week in one of their
Oh,
newsletters. So
awesome. Congrats.
it's thank you. It's just been great because you need for myself, I feel like I need a place where I feel like I belong, where I'm supported, where I'm going to be able to create this meaningful connections like the one that I'm now having with you
Hmm.
for my business, but really even beyond that, right? Just so like I think as women, we need to continue to lift each other up and support each other. And so finding those spaces where you feel supported, where you know that you're going to meet great people with good intentions, where there's no sense of competition, but really just support. I think it's so important to succeed as a business owner. Like we can't, I don't think an entrepreneur can really succeed in a siloed or in a bubble. You have to be able to build these connections, and a great place to start is joining these types of communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a very good way to put it. And I'm sure, a question I get all the time when people want to start a podcast, they're like, how do I come up with topics? What do I talk about? How am I going to have enough content for every single week? But being in these aligned communities helps you see what
Hmm.
problems people are having to talk to those issues or situations or dilemmas directly. So,
Yeah.
can you talk about how you plan out what topics you're going to cover in your show?
Yeah, definitely. So I really let my guest stories shine. So the topics are really from their story, right? Because
Hmm.
everyone's going to have a different story. And so basically a little bit about my process is I do some outreach on communities like Entreprenista or other Latinas, and or reach out to people on Instagram has been a great place to just DM people. For anyone who's starting a podcast, like you can literally just find anyone on Instagram, and people like to talk, people like to connect. So like don't be afraid to reach out and just be like, hey, I love the work that you're doing. I have this podcast. Would love to chat more. And they're not interested or not interested, but I've received really good
Hmm.
responses back on Instagram. And then I do what I call it internally a vibe check call. So it's a call that I do to just get to know my guests a little bit better. It's just 30 minutes. I tell them what I'm looking to do in this podcast, some of the topics that we discuss, like entrepreneurship, career development, mental health, and community. Those are kind of my four main pillars. And then I ask them to tell me about their story. And then we spend most of the call just learning about them. And Haley, I come up with like right then and there like 20 topics. And I'm like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, we're not gonna have enough time to cover all of these. But they're the running themes that I like to still have, like the entrepreneurial journey and where you grow up and your upbringing. But then the meat of the episode, it's always going to vary based on what that person experienced as a challenge or as a win in their life. I've interviewed women who are moms, and I've interviewed women who have decided they never want to become moms, and I've interviewed women who have been like the oldest sibling and how that has shaped their lives, and then just like all range of experiences and backgrounds. And so that's the meat of the episode. So come up with some topics. I send them to them because I want to make sure that they get a say on what we're going to talk about. And then they add any other topics they're like really passionate about discussing. And then when we start the episode and when we start the recording, I tell them like these topics I'm always going to have on my second monitor just as a guide, as an anchor. But this conversation is going to flow and is going to take us where it has to
Yeah.
take us in that moment, right? So I'm very much a dance in the moment kind of person when I'm interviewing, because if my guest in that moment felt really comfortable being vulnerable and opening up about something that we hadn't talked about before, like let's go there together. So yeah, I really let my guest stories inform the topics that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. I mean, some people love sticking to questions, but I always have an outline, same with you, and then kind of just
Yeah.
see where it goes. And like, if we get to those questions, great. If we don't, I'm sure we still had like an even better conversation. So
Yes.
that's really great. I like the concept of the vibe check because
Yeah.
then you can really get to know them. I mean, people are so much more than their bios, and that's really, I think, back to what your
Yeah.
podcast is about. Like, people are more than just appears to the eye. And so being able to meet them and just have that sense of connection before getting on a podcast episode works
Yeah.
really well for some people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes them more comfortable too. And like you said, I want them to know in that vibe check for them to get to know me too and know like they don't have to be politically correct. They don't have to be all buttoned up. Like they can say things
Yeah,
however they want to say them and it's going to be welcomed, right? Like
totally.
whenever people ask me like, do you want me to be more professional in the podcast? I'm like, be you,
Yeah.
because that's what's going to make a great episode. The more real you can be, like I know there's a microphone in front of you, but like the more real you can be, the better. And my goal, and this is what I would like my advice to anyone who's looking to start a podcast and like what's been working really well for me, it's like making your guests feel so comfortable that they forget that they're on a podcast almost.
Yeah.
And that's happened to me many episodes where we've laughed, where my guest has cried, I have cried, and I'm like, is this therapy? But like maybe. And like you just kind of you forget that you like it's one a piece of feedback that I get a lot that makes me really proud of what I'm doing. At the when I finish recording and I press stop, I'll ask them like, how did you feel? And they're like, oh my gosh, this was so good. And they're like, I had so much fun. And they're like, I like forgot we were on a podcast. Like it just
Oh,
felt like we were having a conversation, like
yeah.
having coffee somewhere, or like having drinks, or like having chai latte somewhere. And like that's a like you want your guests to not feel tense and like stressed out. Just make them feel like they're just having a conversation and the conversation will just flow.
Oh, totally. That's really great advice for sure. And I think that just comes with practice as well. The more confident you are as a host, the more confidence your
Yeah.
guest will feel too. If you're
Yeah.
taking pauses and, trying to see what the next scripted question is, that it doesn't give for that feeling of we're having a conversation. So being able to flip back and forth between what you're trying to say and what the guest is saying. It comes back to like
Yeah.
listening to understand rather than listening just to respond. That's a whole
Yes.
thing that I'll have a whole episode about on this podcast.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's just so important to listen to what your guest is saying because they're saying those good things that are going to like
Yeah.
direct the conversation. So I love that advice that you shared.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please do that episode. I want to listen to
I will.
it.
I will. No, I love that. So before we get into the rapid fire section that I have for us, I'd love to hear how you direct people from your podcast to your business because they,
Mm.
you're speaking to ideal clients and they're going to share the episode with potential clients as well. So how do you intertwine everything to work with your business?
Yeah, great question. Because I also feel like my podcast is a branding and marketing opportunity for
Yeah.
me to drive that traffic. Because I think the first way that I do it is very organic. It's just that when you go on someone's website, you probably spend like, I don't know, 20 seconds before you decide if you want to work with them, right? And so you can read like a beautifully designed website and like, yeah, these words sound great. But if you click on, and I have it on my website, I'm sorry, my podcast page, and you click on whatever episode you're listening to, you can really get to know the real me.
Mm,
And I think people work with people that they like at the end of the day. And it's a good way for me to also filter out people who might not be a good fit as clients for me, right? Maybe the way that I express myself or talk about career development doesn't resonate with them, but for the people who do, I think that's what's really important, because they get to hear me on a podcast. So it's almost like through my podcast, I'm selling my brand, I'm selling myself. Like, if you hire me as your coach, this is who you get. These are the opinions that I would have. This is how I would probably push you and challenge you. Because when I'm having conversations with my guests, it's not just an interview. I like it to be a two-way street. So I will also introduce a lot of my insights. So if I'm talking to someone about interviewing, I'll come in and I'll share like a piece of advice, or I'll say, yes, this is what I coach when I coach my clients. This is what I tell them. Or if we're talking about negotiation, I'll come in and also share a piece of advice. So that is, I think, the strongest way in which I use my podcast as a way of presenting. If I were to work with you, this is exactly how I would speak to you when we're
yeah.
going into those topics that you need career advice on. And then the other way is I always introduce myself in my podcast and my trailer and in the beginning, the intro of my episode, as I'm a career coach and the founder of Latinas Ahead. I have all of my links on my podcast to book a discovery call, which is free. And I have links for my Instagram accounts for Latinas Ahead, which is my coaching business, so people can connect with me. And the other day, actually, I had someone who might become a potential client who found me on an episode from TikTok that I posted a clip, and they messaged me and they're like, "You sound great. What else? What do you do as a career coach?" And so we've been chatting. And so yeah, I think it's, again, just portraying myself as real as possible, how I would work with you as a coach, because this is my approach when I
Hmm.
talk about these topics. I think it's also really important for people to see what I'm passionate about in my episodes, like before they decide if they want to work with me, is seeing that I'm really, really passionate about helping Latinas grow in their careers. And it's not just me just saying that to get clients, like I really live it and breathe it every day. And then, yeah, just promoting my business as well. I do some repurposing and cross promotion between Latinas Ahead and my Not Your Spicy Latina accounts. I have too many accounts, Haley. I'm trying to get a social media manager right now for my second account because
Yeah.
it's a lot. But yeah, just trying to drive people back into my website, which is where they can find all of my information.
Very cool. Yeah, I love how all of those intertwine. I know having all these different accounts, I think is good in the long run, but in the moment, especially if you don't have like a podcast manager or a social media manager, you're like,
Yeah. Yes,
outsourcing's
it's a
great.
lot.
Outsourcing's great. Do you have anyone working on your podcast with you, or is it just you?
It's just me. I hired someone to help me with editing the
Hmm.
episodes because I was like, this is just too much. I haven't mentioned this, but I still work my 9 to 5. And then I have my business and my podcast.
Yeah,
So I need to be very intentional about
for
how I'm
sure.
spending not just my time, but my energy. So, yes, I have someone who helps me edit my episodes. Otherwise, I would crumble into pieces every day.
No, yeah, that's an easy thing to outsource. And honestly, I think
Yeah.
all business owners should outsource parts of, their podcasting. I
Yeah.
think it's easy for us to be
Please.
like, oh, yeah, someone should help me with my social media. But definitely, podcasting is a good place to outsource as well.
Yeah, please
Yeah.
outsource. Make your life easier.
Before we get into the rapid fire section, is there any other pieces of advice you'd like to give to podcasters or aspiring podcasters?
Yeah, I have a couple. So one I had mentioned earlier, like one piece of advice. The
Yeah.
other one is my very first podcast episode. I did it with a friend. So I interviewed them. I interviewed her. She is a yoga teacher, and so we talked about mindfulness and meditation. But the reason I mentioned that she's a friend is that I think that's a great first episode for anyone who's like trying to get their feet wet and like you're still practicing your interviewing skills. Do it with someone that you're comfortable with. Like that's just a great, like, I remember my first episode, I was like, Angel, I'm so nervous to press record. And she was like, just do it. But because we've had so many long 1 hour conversations in the past as friends, we just treated that podcast episode as if we were just talking at
Hmm.
a coffee shop. And it made me feel more confident about the next episode with someone who wasn't a friend.
Yeah.
So I would say if you're starting out, maybe try to find someone. If you can't find like a close friend, find someone that at least you're very comfortable with, or who you know will make it easier for you, I guess, for your first time. And then be yourself as much as possible. Like, I remember when my editor was doing my first episodes, he was editing my first episodes. I laugh a lot during my calls. Like, so, and like I laugh really loud. I'm the kind of person who laughs with her whole body. So
I
it's
love
almost
that.
like
I love that.
it's everything. And I remember I was like, oh my gosh, I have laughed so much. And I asked them, I was like, hey, can you just edit out every single place that I laughed? And he got back to me and he's like, do you not want to show people that you laugh in your episodes? And I was like, oh, you're right. Because if you take it out, I'm going to sound like I'm a serious person who has no sense of humor, who has no reactions to
Hmm.
things. So now I embrace it. So, like, don't be afraid to be quirky, be funny, be yourself. And remember, at the end of the day, if there are things that you're like, oh gosh, I shouldn't have said this, it's there's a beauty of the editing portion of the episode. So you can, like, in the editing room, like, all these wonderful things happen. So don't put too much pressure on yourself, because you can edit the episode, but like, remain authentic, remain real, let people hear you laugh or have reactions or be funny, because I think that's just as important.
I love that last tip. It's totally what I do in my business too, because I edit episodes for my clients. And yeah, I've had that conversation with them before of they request a certain edit. And I'm like, but that's so you. Like, do you really want to take that
Yeah.
out? And sometimes it's yes. Normally it's like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I don't know. We're just all so judgmental of ourselves that it's easy to be like, erase the whole thing. But
Yeah.
truly, like, leave yourself in there. And there is a difference between like not editing your episode at all and then like editing it for clarity but leaving in your personality, and that's what I always
Yes.
strive for. So
Yes.
like, yeah, my clients can request any edits they want, but normally I'll be like, but it's so good, like, do you really want
Yeah.
to? But on the other hand, like you said, you can make any edits in, post production.
Yeah.
Like, when I work with my clients, I'm the only one that hears the raw format and no one else ever will. And they'll leave me little notes like, Haley, can you erase that? Or like, Haley, help me out. That sounded really bad. Like, can you pull something together? And they're like, love you, Haley. And that just makes me so happy. They just leave me notes along the way. So yeah, there's a
Oh.
lot of magic in editing for sure.
Yes, so much magic. So, like, trust the editing process, because it's a good
Definitely.
one.
Yeah. And give yourself grace. Like, we all make mistakes
Yeah.
when we talk. So in post production, you can definitely clean it up.
Yeah,
Oh,
totally.
well, I love all of those tips that you shared. Thanks so much. I am excited to
Yeah.
get into this rapid fire section with you. So I have 8 questions. All right,
Okay.
so let's get into it. So my first question for you is, what's the first podcast you ever listened to?
Uh, oh, the moth. They do
Okay.
like this. I can't explain what it is,
Yeah.
but it's like storytelling, short episodes
Yeah.
on storytelling. So it was the moth, but then the first podcast episode that really got me into like podcast was Armchair Expert.
I love that. Yeah, The Moth is so popular, and I love that storytelling style. So those are both
Yeah.
great. Okay, other than your genre of podcasting, what is your favorite genre to listen to?
Oh gosh. Okay, so people, don't be scared, but true crime gets me. Like, I can't. I can listen to a true crime podcast to go to bed.
Yeah.
Like, that's how bad it is. But I love true crime. And I love reality TV podcasts, just like the
Me too.
recaps, the reviews.
Oh my gosh.
Ah, so good. It's like an escape.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes I have my moments where I need my educational podcast, but then sometimes I just need like the funny podcast where I'm just gonna laugh and like hear about reality TV.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What's your favorite reality TV series?
Right now, Love is Blind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
But the Bachelor
Mm,
franchise has been, even though I have a lot of issues with the Bachelor franchise and lack of diversity,
yeah.
but it just hooks me in. And Love is Blind, I've watched so many from so many, like all the countries.
yeah.
I'm in Argentina right now. Like it's just been my treat at the end of the week.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I'm a big reality TV fan too. I love the Housewives
Yes.
series, and
Oh.
that's pretty much like if I'm not working, I'm watching Housewives. Truly.
Yeah.
That's where you can find me.
I love it.
yes. Okay, my next question is, do you have a dream podcast guest?
America Ferreira would be. I'm gonna go with her.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
You could do it for sure.
Yeah. I hope
okay.
so.
What is one podcast you'd recommend everyone listen to?
Yo Quiero Dinero podcast is a really good one. It's how I learned about finance and investing. The
Mm-hmm.
host is Janice Torres, and she's amazing. She breaks it down to you like you're an 8-year-old, and she's also Latina. And so I feel like there's a lot of empowerment there for other Latinas who don't typically think about investing
Yeah,
and financing. So, really, really great podcast.
absolutely. I do love that one too.
Oh, so good.
So good. Okay, do you have any pet peeves when it comes to listening to podcasts?
Hmm. That's a good question. Any pet peeves? Okay, I have two. One, of course, ads, because like why?
Mm-hmm.
But I know they're important,
Yeah.
obviously. But I think the real pet peeve, because like ads will go away eventually. When people kind of like it takes a very long time to get into the episode. Like if it took 10, 15 minutes to get into the meat of the episode, that is a pet peeve of
Mm.
mine.
Oh my gosh, I so
Yeah.
agree with you. No one has said that yet on the show, and that's also a big pet. I have hundreds of pet peeves, but that definitely is one of them. And I'm like, oh my God, can we get into it already?
Yes.
like,
I'm like, when? That's why what I love now is that you can do timestamps and
yeah,
chapters. So when I'm on YouTube, I'll just go and just like fast forward. But
yeah.
when I'm on Spotify, I can't. So I'm like, oh, when are we going to get to the actual episode?
Oh my gosh. And when it says introduction and then the next time block is like 10 minutes later, you're like, what?
Yeah.
How did all that?
You're
Like, what do you mean?
Yes.
yeah, no. Fully agree with you. That's such a good one. And a
Yeah.
good tip for all of the listeners to kind of hear that
Yeah.
maybe that's not the best thing to do.
Yeah. Don't do that.
Okay. So, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received about podcasting?
Ooh, best piece of advice that I've received about podcasting. Oh, I think it was to not make it, to put in like my sauce in it. Because initially, and it was the first friend that I interviewed actually, she had a podcast before. And so she had told me, because I had like initially been a little bit more structured about the
Mm-hmm.
interview approach. And she was like, Theo, people also are coming to the podcast to listen to you. Like, think about it. I'm only going to be in one episode, but you are the constant thread of your podcast. Like, you're going to be in every single episode, and people are going to get to know you the more and more episodes that they listen to. So, you want to also have an opinion, and you also want to have an insight. So, when your guest is saying something, don't just skip to the next question, like actually react, because I know you have so many opinions about everything. So I was like, I do. So I think that's been really great piece of advice. Like, even though I have guests and yes, it's interview style, I now treat it more like a conversation. So then I also have a space to share those insights and opinions with my listeners.
Totally. Oh, that's a really good one. I tell people that all the time too, because I'm like, sure, people will love your guests, but if they don't love you, they're not going to come back. Like, yeah, they might drop
Yes.
in for one episode, but if you don't leave an impact, what's going to keep them listening, you know? And so
Yes.
if your downloads, and I'm sure you look at your analytics too, but I'm sure, you know, one thing I note with all podcasters is if you have a big guest and you're not retaining a lot of those listeners, like your
Mm.
listens spike, which is totally
Yep.
normal when you have a guest with a large reach. But if it
Yep.
drops down to like where you were before, you probably should be hooking them in some other way. And so that's just a good place
Yeah.
to kind of note, like, how is my interviewing style? Am I letting people know? Like you said, you put in your intro who you are, and then throughout the episode, you continuously put in your 2 cents, right? And so, of
Yeah.
course, when we get big guests, it goes way up in our downloads, and then of course it will dip. Of course, that's just what happens. But if it's
Yeah.
dipping like all the way up and
Yeah.
all the way down, that's kind of where you can look back at your interviewing style. So that's a really great
Yeah.
piece of advice. I love that.
Thank you. Yeah. Put like it's your podcast.
Yeah,
So like make yourself known and out there.
absolutely. Okay, I have one more question for you, my last one. So, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned about yourself from podcasting?
Yeah, I've learned I've always known that I enjoy connecting with people and that I enjoy these one-on-one moments. I prefer this intimate moments one-on-one more than like a big group setting.
Hmm.
But I think something that I'm really proud of myself and that's been surprising is that I think I'm really good at carrying a conversation and that dance in the moment. I used to think, oh, I need to have like all my notes and all my
Yeah.
questions to like do a good job, but I'm very good at improvising and I think at asking questions that are meaningful, not just for the sake of asking them and just like kind of put a check mark or I asked this question, but I'm really good at getting to the core of someone's story, and I feel like I've surprised myself in my ability to like when I have a guest who's telling their story, I feel a sense of responsibility to honor that moment with them. Like you have trusted me to share your story on this platform that I've created, so I'm going to care for it deeply and I'm going to do my best to go where I feel like I can go, like even if we get a little bit personal, to like I don't know, to make the story, to make those like powerful moments come out
Hmm.
in someone's story, right? That sometimes take time. And I think this is when we've gotten emotional. And I love those moments, right? When we've been able to go there together. And that's been really surprising. I was like, I knew I like connecting with people, but I think seeing that I've been able to unlock this moments that are really meaningful as part of their story as a storyteller, as an interviewer, has been really wonderful for me to learn about myself.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. That's really, really great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining me. I have absolutely loved
Yeah.
this conversation. So,
Me
what's
too.
next for you and Not Your Spicy Latina podcast?
Yes. So I'm looking for a social media manager. So that's the next step. I am currently recording episodes for next year, which I'm really excited. And I haven't done an episode by myself yet. I've only interviewed
Mm,
guests. So I'm going to have one of my guests actually is going to come back to the podcast and she's going to interview me because I think it's important for people to hear my story on the podcast. So we're going to do some interviewing and I think I'm going to start doing a couple, maybe once a month. I'll do like a solo episode where I'll do a Q&A time if anyone has questions or career tips, or maybe do like New Year's resolutions at the end of the year. So I think what's next is continuing my series of interviewing guests, but also in the same vein of showing yourself in your podcast and who you are. I'm going to do my first interview where I'll be on the interviewee seat.
yeah.
And I think that will be really exciting.
Oh my gosh, you totally should do that. You'd be so good at it. And I can't wait to listen
Oh,
to those
yeah.
episodes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And where can people connect with you?
Yes. So Instagram, you can follow me at Not Your Spicy Latina Pod and also at Latinas Ahead, which is my career coaching business. I'm also on TikTok at Latinas Ahead and Not Your Spicy Latina Pod. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Fiorella Lopez. And the best place to find all the information related to my coaching business and my podcast would be my website, fiorellalopez.com.
Amazing. Oh my gosh, Phil, this has been so fun. I will put all of your links
Yes.
in the show notes, and I
Yes.
can't wait for people to go and listen to your show and connect with the community that you're building.
Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on your show. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.